Before we start, you should know this might be hard to hear. This is just for learning and fun. This is the real words from Diddy's trial in court, told by people who report on court cases. You want to know about this shocking news that changed everything about Diddy's case? Please like this video and follow our channel to get more updates as this crazy story keeps going. The New York courthouse saw something today that will change Diddy's court case forever. Something nobody expected happened that was very emotional. Janice Combs, Diddy's 83-year-old mom, came to court as a surprise witness to help the prosecutors. She said things that left her son looking broken and shocked in the courtroom. For months, people have been saying bad things about the prosecutors have been building a case about him doing illegal business stuff and hurting people. During all the court meetings, Diddy stayed confident and calm. He often looked like nothing bothered him when people testified against him. His lawyers kept saying the witnesses were lying and the evidence was fake. They tried to make people doubt if the prosecutors could really win this case. But nobody, not the prosecutors, not the defense lawyers, and definitely not Diddy himself, was ready for what happened when Janice Combs walked slowly to the witness stand with help from a court officer. When she promised to tell the truth, Diddy's calm face changed right away. He leaned forward with confusion and worry all over his face as he whispered quickly to his lawyers. The woman who had always defended him the most, who raised him by herself in Harlem, who stood by him through every problem and celebrated every win, was now ready to testify against him. And when she spoke, her quiet but strong voice carried years of painful knowledge that she was finally ready to share. "I've protected my son his whole life," she started, looking at Diddy across the courtroom, "but I can't protect him from the truth anymore." What she said next was so powerful and so devastating that people who write down what happens in court said even tough legal workers were openly crying. Diddy, who had shown strength through all his legal troubles, fell apart as his mother confirmed what prosecutors, victims, and watchers had thought but could never prove for sure until now. This isn't just another celebrity scandal. It's the moment when one of music's most powerful people faced a truth he couldn't escape. And it came from the one person whose love and support he never questioned. The full story starts with why Janice Combs finally decided to speak up. What exactly she told everyone and how her words changed not just the legal case, but also how people will remember Diddy forever. "I'm standing outside the federal courthouse in Manhattan where people are still very emotional hours after what many are calling the most dramatic testimony in recent court history. People who watched Janice Combs testify are still clearly affected. Some are talking in quiet voices about how much what happened inside affected them. The day started normal enough. Diddy's trial entered its 6th week with prosecutors expected to call money experts to testify about alleged illegal money operations. Diddy arrived wearing his usual navy blue suit with a serious face, surrounded by his team of expensive lawyers. He nodded slightly to supporters before going into the building, showing the same controlled confidence he had kept throughout the whole case. Inside the courtroom had settled into its usual rhythm. Judge Raymond Delaney was in charge with his usual attention to following the rules. The jury arranged their notebooks. Court officers stayed in their spots, and both legal teams organized their papers like they always did. Nothing suggested the huge change that was about to happen. The first sign came when lead prosecutor Lena Chambers walked up to the judge for an unplanned private talk. For several minutes, she had an intense discussion with Judge Delaney and defense lawyers, sometimes pointing toward the courtroom doors. Diddy watched with growing worry, clearly trying to figure out what the unexpected thing was. When the private talk ended, Judge Delaney spoke to the court. "Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution has asked permission to call a witness who wasn't planned. After looking at the situation, I have said yes to this request. We will take a 15-minute break before continuing." The courtroom buzzed with people guessing during the break. Diddy huddled with his legal team. Their urgent whispers and serious faces suggested they had no more information about the mystery witness than anyone else. When the court officer finally announced the court was back in session, everyone got quiet and waited. "The prosecution calls Janice Combs," announced Lena Chambers. Her voice was steady, but you could hear something serious underneath. The courtroom doors opened and Janice Combs came in slowly, helped by a court officer. At 83, she moved carefully like someone saving energy for what was coming. She wore a simple dark blue dress and one string of pearls. This was very different from the fancy style often connected with her son's world. Her face looked determined, her eyes clear and focused even though it was clearly hard for her to be there. What happened to Diddy was immediate and huge. The colour left his face as he half stood up from his seat with his mouth open in shock or protest. His main lawyer gently but firmly pulled him back down, whispering urgently in his ear. Diddy's eyes never left his mother as she walked to the witness stand. His face showed confusion, disbelief, and something that looked a lot like fear. As Janice Combs promised to tell the truth, her voice was soft but clear, carrying easily through the quiet courtroom. She adjusted her glasses and settled into the witness chair with her hands folded calmly in her lap. When she finally looked directly at her son, the look wasn't angry but very sad, like someone who had made a terrible decision after thinking about it for a long time. Prosecutor Chambers walked up with unusual gentleness. "Mrs. Combs, thank you for being here today. I understand how hard this must be for you." Janice Combs nodded slightly, staying remarkably calm given the situation. "Some things are hard," she replied, "but necessary." As the questioning started, the feeling in the courtroom changed. This wasn't just another witness testimony. It was the beginning of a mother's painful truth-telling about decades of knowledge, silence, and the terrible results of both. It started like any other day in the ongoing trial, with one small but important difference. Court security had put in place extra procedures, clearing and securing a whole floor before allowing a special visitor to enter through a private elevator. Few people understood the reason for these steps until Janice Combs appeared at the courtroom doors. But when she entered the courtroom, everything changed. You could hear a pin drop as she made her steady way toward the witness stand. Diddy, who had stayed calm and confident throughout the case, suddenly looked like a child caught doing something wrong rather than a powerful music executive. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised even though he had approved adding the witness. Diddy's defense team, who had been looking at documents, froze in shock altogether. Their client's mother, his most loyal supporter and strongest defender, was now under oath in a federal case against him. Janice Combs settled herself in the witness chair with dignity. No eye contact with the defense table, no recognition of the shocked reactions around her, just the straight-backed posture of a woman who had made a very difficult decision. "Mrs. Combs," began Prosecutor Elena Chambers, "thank you for coming forward. Can you explain to the court what made you decide to testify today?" Janice adjusted her glasses, her hands remarkably steady for a woman in her 80s facing such a moment. "I have been quiet for too long," she began, her voice quiet but clear. "When these accusations first came out, I believed what any mother would want to believe, that my son was being targeted unfairly, that the accusations couldn't possibly be true." She paused, taking a slow breath before continuing. "But as the evidence grew, as more victims came forward, I began to see patterns I had seen before, but chose not to notice. 3 weeks ago, I got a letter from a young woman who described her experiences with my son. Her words weren't angry or mean. They were broken, and they matched things I had seen myself over the years." Janice explained that this letter, combined with testimony she had followed in the trial, forced her to face memories she had kept buried for a long time. Incidents going back decades that, when looked at individually, she had explained away or dismissed, but when put together formed a clear pattern of troubling behaviour. "I raised Sean alone after his father died when he was just 3 years old," she continued. "I worked multiple jobs to give him opportunities, to help him escape the hardships we faced. When he found success, I was so proud. But with that success came changes I didn't want to see." She described seeing disturbing behaviour starting in the late 1990s as Diddy's career took off. There were parties she went to where young women seemed uncomfortable or drunk. There were quiet conversations she overheard about problems that needed to be handled. There were sudden staff changes when employees raised concerns. "I told myself these were just the realities of the music industry," Janice admitted, her voice showing regret. "I convinced myself that the rumours were jealousy or lies. When I asked questions, Sean would say, "Mama, don't worry about business matters," or "This is how the industry works." And I chose to believe him because the other option was too painful to think about. The courtroom stayed completely silent as she told about a particular incident from 2001. She had arrived without warning at one of Diddy's properties to bring a home-cooked meal, something she still did regularly despite his fame and fortune. What she found was a young woman in distress being walked out by security people. When I asked who she was, I was told she was just causing problems and had to leave. Later, I saw her name in a settlement agreement document that had been left in Sean's office when I was cleaning up. I confronted him and he told me it was just an unhappy employee trying to get money from him. I wanted to believe that explanation, so I did. As her testimony continued, Janice described a pattern of increasing separation in her son's life and businesses. She was welcome in certain spaces, kept out of others. Certain people would leave rooms when she entered, conversations would stop suddenly. But her position as Mama Combs stayed sacred, respected, honoured, but increasingly kept away from the full reality of her son's world. "I think people assume I knew everything," she said, wiping away a tear. "The truth is, I knew pieces, I saw fragments, and I worked very hard not to connect them because I loved my son and was proud of what he had accomplished coming from where we started." The breaking point, she explained, came after watching the early weeks of the trial. I heard testimony that matched things I had seen but dismissed. I recognized names of people who had come and gone from Sean's life under circumstances that never made sense to me, and I realized that my silence was not protecting my son. It was letting harm continue. Throughout this part of testimony, Diddy stayed completely still, his face like a mask hiding his pain. Only those closest to him could see the slight shaking of his clasped hands or the occasional sharp breath. His lawyers seemed increasingly worried, passing notes and whispering urgently. But Diddy seemed beyond their reach, fascinated by his mother's words and the memories they brought up. When Prosecutor Chambers asked Janice if her decision to testify had been difficult, the elderly woman's composure briefly broke. "He is my son, my only child, the love of my life since the day he was born," she said, her voice breaking slightly. But love without truth becomes something else, something harmful. And I cannot be part of that harm any longer, not even for him, especially not for him. As this part of testimony ended, Janice asked for a brief break. Judge Delaney immediately said yes, telling the jury to return in 15 minutes. As Janice was helped from the witness stand, Diddy's eyes followed her. His face showed he realized that the foundation of his defense, his carefully built public image supported by his mother's unwavering loyalty, had just crumbled beyond repair. When court started again after the break, Janice Combs returned to the witness stand with new determination. The brief break had let her compose herself, though the emotional weight of her testimony was still clear in her careful movements and measured speech. "Mrs. Combs," Prosecutor Chambers began, "you mentioned getting a letter that influenced your decision to come forward. Did you bring that letter with you today?" "I did," Janice confirmed, taking an envelope from her handbag. "I've read it so many times these past weeks that I know parts by heart, but I wanted the exact words to be entered into the record. The letter was submitted as evidence, with copies given to the judge, jury, and defense team. As Diddy's lawyers quickly read the document, their faces got darker. One leaned over to whisper urgently to Diddy, who shook his head like he was denying something. Prosecutor Chambers asked Janice to explain what specifically in the letter had affected her so deeply. The young woman described going to what she thought was a professional networking event at my son's home in 2019. She detailed how the environment changed as the night went on, how drinks were served that left her feeling unusually impaired, how she was separated from her friends, how she was recorded without permission in compromising situations that were later used to make sure she stayed silent. Janice's voice stayed steady, but her hands gripped the rail of the witness stand. What struck me most was her description of being taken to a room she called the White Room, where recordings were made. I knew that room. I had seen it when visiting Sean's home, though it was always described to me as a meditation space or private studio. This confirmation of a specific location described by multiple alleged victims but previously unverifiable sent a ripple through the courtroom. Prosecutors had been trying to prove this room existed for weeks, with defense lawyers dismissing it as made up or confusion about a standard recording studio. Janice continued, describing how the letter writer had mentioned specific artwork, furniture, and unusual architectural details that Janice recognized from her visits to Diddy's home. These weren't things someone could know from magazines or social media posts, she explained. These were private spaces not shown to the public. But the most damaging revelation came when Janice described finding financial records while organizing her son's home office in 2020 during the pandemic lockdown. "Sean has always been generous with me, making sure I'm taken care of," she explained. "During COVID, when he was concerned about my health, he had me stay at one of his properties and asked me to help organize some paperwork that had piled up. He was always somewhat careless with documents, a trait he got from his father. While sorting through papers, Janice discovered a folder containing settlement agreements with non-disclosure provisions. They all followed the same format, with similar language about keeping confidentiality about all interactions and observations at specific properties on specific dates. The amounts varied, but they were all substantial, $50,000 to $2 million. Prosecutor Chambers asked if Janice had confronted her son about these documents. "I did," she confirmed. "He told me they were standard entertainment industry agreements to protect his privacy and creative process. He seemed irritated that I'd seen them, which was unusual." "Sean rarely showed impatience with me. That reaction troubled me more than the documents themselves." Janice then revealed what prosecutors described as the pattern of protection, her own unknowing role in her son's alleged activities. "Looking back, I can see how my presence was used," she said, genuine pain clear in her voice. "Sean would often ask me to attend certain events or visit certain properties, especially when there was media attention or scrutiny. I was the respectable mother figure, the woman who raised him with strong values and faith. My presence created an atmosphere of family and normalcy that made allegations against him seem impossible." She described how Diddy would often use her name when addressing controversies. He would say, "Would I do something like that with my mama in the house?" Or ask people if I was raised that way. I became his character witness without even realizing it. The most difficult moment came when Janice addressed a specific incident from 2022, just months before Diddy's arrest. She had arrived unexpectedly at his Miami property to deliver birthday gifts for his children. "There was clearly a gathering happening that no one expected me to witness," she recounted. "I saw young women who appeared disoriented. I saw security personnel controlling who could enter or leave certain areas. I saw a young man who seemed to be recording something on a professional camera being very forcefully escorted out when I arrived." When she questioned what was happening, Diddy personally took her to another part of the house, explaining it was just a creative session for a music video. "He was unusually attentive that day, making sure I stayed in certain areas of the property, bringing people to meet me rather than letting me move freely as I normally would." Later that evening, Janice overheard an argument between Diddy and a man she identified as his chief of security. The man was saying, "We can't have these kinds of surprises, and your mother can't just show up here." Sean was angry, saying he'd handle his mother and that no one told him what to do in his own house. This incident, combined with the testimony I had been following in the trial, finally broke through decades of denial. "I realized I had been used as a shield," Janice said, her voice finally breaking. "My presence, my love, my reputation had been used to make unacceptable behavior seem impossible." How could a man do such things when he so clearly cherished and respected his mother? But that was the illusion. The reality was happening in rooms I wasn't allowed to enter, at events scheduled when I wouldn't be present. Throughout this testimony, Diddy's composure disintegrated visibly. The swagger and confidence that had characterized his courtroom presence were replaced by a hunched posture and averted gaze. His eyes tightly closed, his breathing becoming noticeably irregular. His lawyers seemed increasingly alarmed, one placing a steadying hand on his arm while another frantically wrote notes. As this phase of testimony concluded, Prosecutor Chambers asked one final question. Mrs. Combs, how difficult was the decision to testify here today? Janice looked directly at her son for the first time since beginning her testimony. It is the most painful thing I have ever done, she said, her voice gentle but firm. I will love him until I die. But true love must be anchored in truth, even when that truth breaks your heart, especially then. At these words, Diddy's control finally shattered. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The composed, powerful music mogul had disappeared, replaced by a son facing his mother's painful truth he could neither deny nor escape. As Janice Combs' testimony continued into the afternoon session, she outlined what prosecutors had been working to establish for weeks, a pattern of control that Diddy allegedly maintained over numerous aspects of his life and businesses. Sean developed very specific systems for everything, Janice explained. Even as a child, he was meticulous about his possessions, particular about who could touch his things or enter his space. As his success grew, this tendency toward control expanded dramatically, divided into distinct spheres, each with its own staff, procedures, and level of access. There was the public sphere, the carefully crafted image of a successful entrepreneur, loving father, and respected music industry pioneer. There was the business sphere, the legitimate enterprises including his music label, clothing line, and beverage partnerships. And then there was what Janice called the shadow operations, activities she glimpsed only in fragments but came to understand were central to the charges against her son. At family gatherings or public events, everything was perfect, joyful, exactly what you'd expect, she said. But I started noticing how some staff members seemed afraid rather than merely respectful, how certain topics would cause immediate changes in conversation, how specific phones were used for specific types of communication. Janice explained that Diddy maintained what his staff called the protocols, strict rules about who could access which properties, who could speak to whom, and how information was compartmentalized. I initially thought these were reasonable security precautions for a wealthy celebrity, but gradually recognized they served another purpose, containing knowledge and controlling narrative. There were people in Sean's organization whose job seemed to be handling special situations, Janice testified. I never knew their exact titles, but they were the ones called when something unusual happened, or when someone was, as they put it, becoming a problem. She described witnessing staff members being suddenly terminated, often with generous severance packages that seemed disproportionate to their positions. These departures were always explained as restructuring or performance issues, but they frequently happened after these individuals had witnessed concerning incidents or raised questions about certain activities. Janice's description of what she called the book, a detailed record of potential vulnerabilities for people in Diddy's orbit, was particularly revealing. I found it accidentally while looking for a photo album in his home office, she explained. It contained information about business associates, artists, employees, personal details about relationships, financial problems, health issues, legal troubles, things that could be used to pressure someone if needed. When she questioned Diddy about this document, he explained it away as background research necessary for protecting his businesses from potential liabilities. He said everyone in the industry maintained similar information, that it was just good business practice to know who you were dealing with. I wanted to believe that explanation. Janice also described a pattern of financial control that extended beyond normal business operations. Sean would often present significant gifts to people who had shown absolute loyalty, specifically those who had remained silent about troubling incidents. These weren't just bonuses or normal compensation. They were houses, cars, college tuition for children, life-changing amounts of money that created deep obligation. The most revealing element of Janice's testimony concerned how Diddy allegedly maintained control over those who had directly experienced his most problematic behavior. She described witnessing the aftermath of what staff euphemistically called difficult evenings. Situations where guests at Diddy's residences had experienced events that required special handling. There was a procedure, Janice explained. First, medical attention if necessary, always provided by private doctors who came to the property rather than taking the person to a hospital. The individual would be reminded of confidentiality agreements they had signed, shown recordings from the evening, and presented with what was called a consideration package to ensure continued discretion. Throughout this portion of testimony, Diddy remained uncharacteristically subdued. Gone was the confident figure who had often reacted to previous witnesses with headshakes or whispered comments to his attorneys. He slumped, occasionally closing his eyes as if physically pained by his mother's words. Janice described how she had rationalized or ignored these patterns for years, partially out of maternal loyalty, but also because Diddy had carefully managed her understanding of his world. "Sean always treated me with public respect and affection," she said. "He made sure I was financially secure, that I had beautiful places to live, that I wanted for nothing. He presented himself as a son who honored his mother above all else. And that was true in many ways, but it was also strategic. Who would believe terrible things about a man who so clearly cherished his mother?" She paused, emotion briefly overwhelming her composure. "I was used as character evidence without even knowing it. The illusion that everything was legitimate, that the rumors couldn't possibly be true." As this section of testimony concluded, Prosecutor Chambers asked, "Based on what you personally witnessed over the years, do you believe the allegations against your son have merit?" Janice Combs straightened in the witness chair, her dignity intact despite the emotional toll of her testimony. "I believe that my son, whom I love deeply, created systems of control and intimidation that hurt people. I believe he used his power, his charm, and his resources to silence those he harmed. And I believe that by remaining silent myself, I became part of that system." She looked directly at Diddy as she delivered her final statement of this segment. "I am here today because I cannot be complicit any longer, even if that truth causes pain to the person I love most in this world. Especially then." Judge Delaney called for an extended lunch recess following the emotional intensity of the morning testimony. When proceedings resumed, the atmosphere in the courtroom had transformed. Diddy had returned with a noticeably different demeanor, subdued, almost resigned, occasionally making eye contact with his mother, in what observers described as silent acknowledgement, rather than the anger or betrayal one might expect. His defense team appeared equally affected. Their typically aggressive posture was replaced by a more measured approach that suggested a significant strategy shift was underway. Lead attorney James Morrison requested a brief sidebar before testimony resumed, resulting in an intense discussion at the bench that concluded with Judge Delaney nodding solemnly. When Janice Combs returned to the witness stand, Prosecutor Chambers shifted the focus to what had finally compelled her to come forward after decades of silence. "Miss Combs, you've described a pattern of behavior you observed over many years," Chambers began. "What specifically prompted you to contact our office at this particular time?" Janice adjusted her glasses, her hands steady despite the obvious emotional weight of the situation. "Two things," she explained. "The first was reading the grand jury testimonies that became public during the early phases of this trial. Hearing the experiences described by these young people, the fear, the manipulation, the lasting trauma, I recognized patterns I had seen myself but had chosen not to acknowledge fully. This forced her to reevaluate countless memories, incidents, conversations, and observations that she had previously dismissed or rationalized. It was like looking at a familiar photograph and suddenly seeing a complete different image," she said. "The same events, the same people, but understood in an entirely new context." The second catalyst, she explained, was more personal and more profound. 3 months ago, my granddaughter, Sean's daughter, turned 18. At her birthday celebration, I overheard her talking with friends about an industry event she had been invited to attend. The way she described it, the promised connections, the exclusive access, the career opportunities, it was almost identical to scenarios I had heard described in testimony. Janice's voice wavered slightly for the first time. I realized in that moment that the patterns were continuing into the next generation, that without intervention, young people, including those in our own family, would continue to be vulnerable to the same systems of exploitation. I could not remain silent, knowing that my granddaughter and others her age could face the same situations I had witnessed. She described the agonizing process of reaching her decision. For weeks, she reviewed journals she had kept over the years, noting instances that had troubled her, but that she had never confronted directly. She reread text messages and emails that, viewed through her new understanding, took on disturbing implications. She even visited properties where she had witnessed concerning incidents, trying to reconcile her memories with her evolving awareness. I spoke with my pastor, Janice continued. I prayed for guidance. I considered whether there might be a way to address these issues privately within the family. But the more I reflected, the more I understood that private intervention would not be sufficient. Too many people had been hurt. Too many systems remained in place that could continue causing harm. The breaking point came when she received news that a young woman who had previously worked as an assistant in Diddy's organization had attempted suicide. This young woman had been suddenly dismissed about 2 years ago, Janice explained. At the time, Sean told me she had been caught stealing and was terminated with a generous severance to avoid pressing charges. I accepted that explanation without question. Learning of the suicide attempt through family connections, Janice reached out to the young woman's mother. What she told me was entirely different from what I had been led to believe. Her daughter had witnessed something at one of Sean's properties that deeply disturbed her. When she raised concerns, she was immediately removed from her position, presented with a non-disclosure agreement, and given a settlement that, while financially significant, came with explicit threats about the consequences of breaking confidentiality. The young woman had struggled with depression and substance abuse in the aftermath, ultimately leading to her suicide attempt. Her mother told me she couldn't live with what she knew, but she was too afraid to speak about it. This revelation became the tipping point, Janice said. I realized then that my silence was no longer protective. It was harmful, not just to those who had already been hurt, but to those who might be hurt in the future if these patterns continued. She described making the difficult decision to contact prosecutors directly rather than first confronting her son. I knew that if I spoke to Sean first, he would use the same tactics that had worked for decades: charm, rationalization, appeals to family loyalty. He would remind me of all he had done for our family, for the community, for young artists, and he wouldn't be entirely wrong about those positive contributions, but they don't erase or justify the harm. Janice revealed that she had written Diddy a letter explaining her decision, which was delivered to him the morning of her testimony. I wanted him to hear my reasons from me, in my own words, rather than being blindsided completely. I owed him that much as his mother. But I could not give him the opportunity to dissuade me or to prepare counters to what I might say. As she described this final decision, Diddy's composure, already fragile throughout the day, completely collapsed. For the first time in the lengthy proceedings, the music mogul openly wept, making no attempt to hide his emotional breakdown. His attorneys, clearly concerned, tried to comfort him while simultaneously signalling to the judge. Judge Delaney observed the situation with grave attention before addressing Diddy directly. "Mr. Combs, do you need a brief recess?" In a moment that courtroom observers would later describe as remarkable, Diddy shook his head and responded in a voice barely above a whisper, "No, Your Honor. I need to hear this. I need to hear all of it." It was a stunning reversal for a defendant who had maintained rigid control throughout the proceedings, an acknowledgement that his mother's testimony had penetrated defences that no other witness had been able to breach. Janice's final statement in this section seemed directed not at the court, but at her son. "Sometimes the greatest act of love is the hardest truth," she said, her eyes meeting Diddy's across the courtroom. "I have loved you every day of your life, Sean. That will never change. But love without accountability becomes something else, something harmful. And I cannot be part of that harm any longer, not even for you. Following another brief recess, the courtroom reconvened for what would become the most extraordinary moment in the already remarkable proceedings. Judge Delaney addressed both legal teams before testimony resumed. Counsel, I understand there have been developments during the recess that may affect how we proceed, he stated. Would either side like to address the court before we continue? Lead defense attorney James Morrison stood. Yes, Your Honor. With the court's permission, my client would like to address Mrs. Combs directly before cross-examination begins. This unprecedented request caused immediate reaction. Prosecutors objected strenuously, citing procedural concerns and potential witness intimidation. Judge Delaney considered briefly before responding. This is highly unusual, he acknowledged. However, given the unique circumstances and relationship between the witness and defendant, I will permit a brief direct address with strict conditions. Mr. Combs may speak only with the court's permission, will remain at the defense table, and must address his comments to the court rather than directly to the witness. At any sign of intimidation or inappropriate content, I will terminate this accommodation immediately. With parameters established, Diddy stood slowly, his physical demeanor transformed from the confident figure who had entered the courthouse that morning. He gripped the table for support, his voice low but clear enough to carry through the silent courtroom. Your Honor, I would like to address some comments to my mother, he began, his voice unsteady. If the court permits. Judge Delaney nodded. You may proceed, Mr. Combs. Remember the conditions I've outlined. Diddy took a deep breath, visibly struggling for composure. For my entire life, my mother has been my foundation, he said. Everything I've achieved, every success I've claimed, I've attributed to her strength, her sacrifice, her love. I've used her name, her reputation, her goodness as a shield. How could I be guilty of these things? Look at the woman who raised me. He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. What the court has heard today is the voice of the strongest person I've ever known doing the hardest thing imaginable, telling truths that I've spent decades hiding, even from her, especially from her. His attorneys appeared stunned by this apparent admission, one placing a cautioning hand on his arm, which Diddy gently but firmly removed. I have lived two lives, he continued. The public life of success, philanthropy and family that my mother believed in and was proud of, and a private life of excess, exploitation and corruption that I worked tirelessly to keep hidden from her and from public view. I convinced myself that these separate worlds could coexist, that the good in one somehow balanced the harm in the other. Diddy's voice broke as he continued. For years, I've faced accusations and denied them all. I've attacked the credibility of witnesses, questioned the motives of prosecutors, and leveraged every resource at my disposal to maintain the illusion of innocence. But I cannot deny my own mother. I cannot call her a liar when she has spoken only truth. The courtroom remained in stunned silence as Diddy continued, each word seeming to physically cost him. The systems of control she described, the manipulation, the intimidation, she witnessed only fragments. The reality was far worse than what she knew. At this point, his defense attorneys moved to intervene, clearly alarmed by what amounted to a confession in open court. Lead counsel urgently whispered to Diddy, who shook his head and continued despite their obvious distress. I stand here today broken by the truth, Diddy said, his voice steadying as if finding strength in finally confronting reality. Not broken by my mother's testimony, but by the recognition of what my actions have done to her, to countless others, and ultimately to myself. Judge Delaney, recognizing the extraordinary nature of the moment, allowed Diddy to continue despite repeated objections from his own legal team. Your Honor, I've spent decades building an empire on image, influence, and fear. I've hurt people, many people, and convinced myself it was justified by success or standard industry practice. Hearing my mother describe what she saw, knowing it represents only a fraction of the truth, I cannot continue this charade. Diddy turned slightly toward his mother, though still addressing his comments to the court as instructed. The strongest act of love isn't protection or loyalty, it's truth. My mother understood that. I never did, or perhaps I never wanted to. As Diddy concluded his unprecedented statement, the courtroom remained in shocked silence.